You're listening to the Second Look podcast, where we take a closer look at what we're learning each Sunday at Connection Church to help you grow in your walk with Christ. Here are your hosts, Pastor Joe Terreri and Pastor Dan DeRochers.
Welcome to The Second Look. My name is Dan.
And I am Joe.
And we're here talking about finding freedom from religion. But first, hey, Joe.
Hello, Dan.
That is a nice shirt you're wearing today.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. You know me. Whenever people see me, I'm always dressed up.
That's right. Well, I mentioned your shirt today for two reasons.
Yes.
Because yesterday's sermon featured a shirt.
Yes.
And also, that shirt.
What's wrong with this shirt?
There's nothing inherently wrong with the shirt, but since this is the second look, I thought we should tell people that Tim and I have requested, maybe mandated, that you can't wear this shirt anymore when you preach.
No.
And so it is getting a second life.
It's getting on the second look.
On the second look.
Wow, that's amazing. My wife loves this shirt. I put it on today, and she immediately wanted to hug me. And so she said, honey, you look so nice. And so I'm like, thank you. And then I told her I'm not allowed to preach in this shirt, so I got to find other times to wear it.
And the reason why Joe is not able to preach in this shirt is because of the tiny, fine lines that are on it that really wreak havoc with our camera system.
Yeah. And I just want to say you're welcome to the two people who care about this conversation, Dan and Tim.
Also, Dan O'Connor.
Oh, Dan O'Connor.
Yes, as a video professional, and I'm sure at least a half dozen others.
I was going to say maybe 6 people, all of which are on our tech team.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. But yesterday, quite a reveal with, first of all, I loved the kind of dramatic pause of you coming out on the stage. You got an applause in all 3 services.
I know. And it was actually like kind of surprising, but I mean, I understood, like people thought it was funny, like, cause it was, and it was definitely shocking.
Yes.
And at the end of the third service, people actually clapped for the message.
They did.
So take that 8:30 and 10, but people never clap. Maybe they were just glad it was over.
It could be.
Thank God this is over. But yeah, so I just really had a lot of fun wearing the tuxedo yesterday. But Dan, it had a purpose. It wasn't just for shock value.
That's right.
It was actually for the sole purpose of showing us illustratively about why we need the king's clothes.
Yeah, and this setting of a wedding
Yeah.
is one of the maybe few times/places where we still really dig deep into formality. And so the idea of dressing up and wearing something that's befitting of the occasion, it really does ring true to today as it did in Jesus' day.
Yeah. And I think that there's this sense where, I know some people have very casual weddings, they get married on a beach or they get married in their parents' backyard and they have a barbecue, and that's all awesome. I love weddings like that too. But there's also something really fun about getting dressed up and about going to a formal wedding. And so, because I think so much of our culture has made everything so casual. Like church, which I'm a huge fan of. But it is still fun to get dressed up and do things, and from proms. But outside of proms and maybe some black tie fundraisers, if you get invited to those things, which by the way I don't, there's really hard to find these places where you dress formally.
And so we're here with this story where Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. And we get brought through this whole story of the king sends his servants to let the invited people know. And you unpacked this really nicely to kind of help us understand the cultural implications of, people weren't wearing their Apple Watches and, it's time to get ready and go, right? But people would be let know when the feast was prepared, when the party was ready. And these parties would go on for days and days, right?
Yeah, a wedding feast was typically a week long, and so you could imagine how long it would take to host all of your family and friends in the whole village. And if it was a royal wedding, we're not just talking about one great dinner. We're talking about meals and meals and meals, and lots of food, lots of preparation, lots of planning, and it was just a big celebration. Here's what I know for certain when I read the Old Testament, Dan. In first century Judaism, they were far better than we could ever dream of being at celebrating.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, people give Europe a hard time for taking off a lot of time from work. I mean, there were, I think, 7 week-long feasts that Israel was commanded to observe, like 7 weeks out of the year.
You must party.
Where you must party. Like, come on. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something about God's character, and you know, for us who are true grinders and think that we're really, you know, making a big difference because we work 40 hours a week, it's like, yeah, I mean, there is something about the heart of God where he's showing us that life in his kingdom is like a party. And that's something that, even in the message yesterday, that you can think about the Pharisees, like, you know what they really didn't want? They really didn't want to come to God's party.
Yeah, and this is exemplified in the story, right? The invited people didn't come. Not only did they not come, they mistreated and killed the servants.
Yes.
And then the king sends out his other servants and says, go invite anyone you can find.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when you think about the initial audience for this parable, the religious teachers, the religious leaders, where do you think, would they have known that they were that first category of people?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And so what I didn't go into, I mean, there's so many things about the parable yesterday I didn't go into. And so one of the things that I didn't say, just because I felt like it needed a lot of explanation, and it's Easter and I didn't want to get sidetracked, I wanted to stay focused on where the sermon was driving to. And by the way, that's always what you have to do in your preaching. You have to choose not to say things because, I mean, I could preach for an hour and cover everything, but that's not our culture, and and that's okay. But what's interesting is the servants in that story, Jesus was probably talking about the prophets throughout the Old Testament who kept coming to Israel and saying to return to the Lord, and then the prophets who were killed. And then what's interesting too is probably that second invitation to come to the kingdom was John the Baptist coming, and then the apostles coming, and then people like you and me inviting people, both the good and the bad, to come to the party. Wow. And so there is this sense where these servants, like, who are the king's servants? It's people throughout the history of salvation, or salvation history is a better way to say that, who have been inviting God's people to return to the Lord, and how God's people have always had hard hearts and not wanting to return. And by the way, we have hard hearts too. It's not like, we're the heroes of the story. The king and his son are. But so they definitely would have understood. And basically Jesus was also saying, you know what you guys really do? Not only do you not come to the party, you've killed my servants. And you celebrate this sordid history of the people of God that really has, when anyone who has come in God's name actually speaking for God, you drowned out their voices. And Dan, I just think we do that in our own lives.
Yeah.
Like when you know, like, we just shout down truth in our life and we ignore it and we stuff it. And I don't want to. It's easy to pick on the religious leaders, but how often has God been trying to reach out to us through people, through his word, and we've ignored it, and we've not come in, and we've not repented, and we've not returned home, and our hearts have been hard. I mean, I've seen that in my own life, so I'm not picking on anyone except saying, like, I've experienced that personally.
Is that, are you talking about specifically times of, like, sin? I mean, how do you see this play out in the church where God's trying to get our attention and we ignore it actively?
Well, I think there's different things. I think there's, like, moments where people are kind of backslidden, per se, and they're kind of running from God. And so the Lord will send people their way, whether it's a praying parent, whether it's a godly friend, whether it's a pastor, whether it's they come to church on Easter and they hear a message and they're like, I'm just here. I mean, how often on Easter does this happen? Mom invites prodigal child to come to church. In order to keep the peace, prodigal child says, okay, I'll come.
Okay, fine, I'll come.
Okay, fine. And I mean, there's some people I see only on Christmas at our church who I know they're there just because their parents invited them. And so they hear the gospel go out, but they've already decided in their heart, like, nope, this isn't for me. This is just what my parents do. And so I do think we close our hearts off to the Lord. So I think there's a prodigal application for that. But then there's also times in our life where the Lord's like, I don't know, calling us to forgive somebody and we dig our heels in, or calling us to let go of some bitterness and finally just forgive someone once and for all and stop bringing it up. My wife actually confronted me about that the other day, not between her and I, but between me and some people in our past. And I was like, I just had this moment where I'm like, yes, my wife is right. Like every time these names come up, I get upset and I need to forgive them. And I need to stop hardening my heart towards God and actually let them go. Yeah. And we ended up having like a impromptu 30-minute conversation about why those people hurt me. But I realized I was closing myself off to the Lord in that way, you know? So I don't think it's just people who are running from God. I think it's when God is calling us to repent. And are we listening to God's servants when they're inviting us to return to the Lord and come into the kingdom?
So in the story, we see people who, you know, the servants go out to the streets, they invite anybody who will come, and we kind of like, I don't know, in my mind, like that cinematic idea of like, oh, and everybody comes and it's
a happy ending.
It's a happy ending. But the parable doesn't end as a happy ending.
Not at all.
It's kind of
It
shocking.
ends up. So you think about how dark the parable is. You have dead servants, mistreated servants, ignored servants, people who are not coming, people invited to the wedding who refuse to come, and then a whole bunch of randos who get invited to the wedding. They all come.
And that's like awesome.
And then you're like, okay, cool. Like,
Yeah.
you guys don't want to come? I'm going to invite these people. And by the way, I want to be clear. It's not like non-Jews, like Dan DeRozier's, Joe Terreri, get invited into God's kingdom because, you know, these people said no. The
Okay,
point
that's
is
good.
not like, hey, because the religious leaders and the people of Israel said no to Jesus,
Right.
now God's changing his plan. And he's like, hey, I'm going to include, you know, the Gentiles now. That's actually not it. Israel was always supposed to be a light to the nations. So God's part was always for the whole world. Israel just overestimated its specialness to God. Okay?
Wow.
Yeah. And that may still be happening. But anyway, my point there is that Jesus is not saying because these people refused, then we all get to come in. Okay? What his point is these people's refusal is actually like, okay, like you're not coming in. Don't worry. I have a lot of other sheep who aren't part of this fold. Jesus said those words.
Yeah.
And so we get invited in. And so there's all these people in, and you think this parable's awesome. King's throwing the wedding. His son comes in. He's getting married. Wedding banquet's full. Sure, I don't know any of these people, but I'm glad they're here. And then the king says, and then all of a sudden the king goes from being real magnanimous, like anyone can come, to real persnickety.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, think about that. Like real exacting. Like, hey, this is great. Why aren't you wearing clothes? The wedding clothes.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good clarification.
Thank you.
We did say publicly this podcast was sometimes slightly inappropriate, and I didn't mean that inappropriate, but it came out. So anyway, and he notices that someone's not wearing clothes, wedding clothes. Not on purpose. Still a little tired
Let's
from
try
yesterday.
that again.
Yeah. And then the king's instructions, tie that person hand and foot and throw him out into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yeah.
So here's how the parable ends, with someone in hell.
Yeah.
That's how the parable ends.
I had never really thought about or maybe even understood the significance of the clothes
Yeah.
until yesterday. And I just thought, man, the kind of parallel of clothing that we can't provide for ourselves, that is Jesus. Like, that's an incredible parallel. Could you explain that just another time about the significance of the wedding clothes and this person's refusal to wear them?
Yeah, so I think that the reason that I said what I said is because the flow of the story is so this is a really important thing. Like, you got to just think about it logically and infer these things. Dinner's ready. So the king was very adamant, dinner's ready. So another way to say that is the food is getting cold.
Yeah.
Go out, and then he tells his servants, after the religious leaders or the first group rejected the invitation, go out and invite everybody in. So basically, it would literally be like, 1 minute I'm standing on the street corner, the next minute I'm at a wedding hall for a royal wedding. And if wedding clothes are required, how do we know they're required? Because that's why the king was so upset at the end of the story.
Right.
Okay. those people needed to get the clothes from somewhere. And it wasn't like everyone was just carrying around their wedding clothes. Just by chance, I get invited to a royal wedding today. Right. Like culturally, it's very easy. The context clues are there. So the big idea is the king had to provide the wedding clothes. Right. And so because because this one guy refused to put the king's clothes on, that's why he ended up in hell. And then what you realize is that we need to be clothed with Jesus Christ, that we need to be clothed with the righteousness of God. And so the king was very adamant that you cannot be at the wedding without the right clothing, and you can't be in the kingdom without the right clothing. And then, so, when we look at the whole context of Scripture, we would say, yes, there's this huge doctrine, theme, repeated teaching in the New Testament. I even read it in my devotions this morning again, about how we need a righteousness that comes by faith, meaning we don't have the right clothing. We're not clothed with Christ. We need someone to give us the right clothes to be acceptable to the king. And the great news is anyone can have the clothes. They just need to receive them, but they need to receive the clothes from the king, the righteousness of Christ. And so here's what that means. When the king sees us, he sees us acceptable for the wedding feast. Yeah. And it's like, hey, you belong because you put the wedding clothes on, you can be here. And that's a picture, it's a metaphor, it's an illustration of our salvation.
Yeah. And he was there. Mm-hmm. He was at the wedding, right? You talk about finding freedom from a religious heart. Mm. And, if we just bring it now into kind of modern day, right? And take it out of the abstract and say someone who attends church, but who hasn't given their heart to Jesus, who isn't clothed in Jesus. That's kind of this person in the story, right? It's like the person is there at the wedding, not on the street.
Right.
And that makes it super interesting to me.
Well, Craig Keener, who's a New Testament scholar, who is, he's a very good New Testament scholar, his commentary about this passage, when the king threw out the guy who wasn't wearing wedding clothes, he actually said something I'm not going to quote it exactly, but he was talking about what a word this is to the church, like for people living right now. Yeah. Like you can think you can be at the wedding, but still not clothed properly. You could be like, I couldn't be more in the orbit of the people of God.
Right.
I couldn't look more like one of the guests at the wedding, and yet I'm not wearing the right clothes. And I just think that word to the church is so important. And Dan, one of the things that is always on the rise in America is nominalism. That we've really created this version of Christianity. And I would say it's mostly a suburban version of Christianity.
Interesting.
Like a middle to upper class version of Christianity, which says, I can go to church and look like the part, but I'm not really following Jesus. And listen, I want to be so clear. I think there are literally hundreds and hundreds of people at Connection Church who are following Jesus. Yeah. My point when I bring this up is never to get everyone questioning their salvation. Here's my point. My point is your heart for God? Does your life belong to Jesus? Are you living for him? And by the way, living for him doesn't earn you salvation.
Right.
Only faith.
Right.
Salvation only comes by faith. And yet, there is this sense where faith without works is a dead faith. And we actually think we can have faith without works, faith without deeds, faith without obedience, faith without surrender. And that's just made up. And the works don't save us. I want to be so clear about that. And yet, when you are saved, you understand you have a king and he calls the shots. And, this weekend we're going to talk about freedom from the self and how God's way that he frees us from ourself and gets us off our own personal agenda onto his agenda is really through pain. And really through letting us get to these places in life where we're totally dependent on the Lord. You don't have to come anymore on Sunday. But But when we think it's God's job just to give us a good life and bless our finances and our family, and by the way, I pray for those things. Like, so I'm not dogging that. But if God's job is to give me an easy life, first of all, we don't know him. And second of all, we've turned him into a slot machine.
Interesting.
And so he's not really a king. He's a means to an end.
Right.
And it's not his ends, it's our ends. And so I just think that in the church, nominal Christianity is basically saying, I can give lip service to God, I'll go to church when I need to, but I am not trusting mind, body, spirit, soul. I am not trusting Christ. And the weird thing is you could be at the same wedding, but it doesn't mean you're a welcome guest because you haven't put the king's clothes on. It's not like you have to earn it. You just have to receive it.
Yeah.
And receiving Christ is trusting Christ.
Do you think his clothes have tiny little patterns like your current shirt? Do you think it's solid color, or do you think it's like big, bold, patterned colors?
Well, Dan, I mean, I don't mean to pull a Jesus juke on you, but I'm guessing it's just pure white. Yeah.
This has been another episode of The Second Look. I don't know how to end it like that. Usually it's funny.
Usually it's funny, but it's
Thanks
like, that's
for
what I
ruining
think.
it.
I think the clothes are pure white because that's what we need.
Yes. Okay, fine.
All right.
It was really good.
It was really good.
This has been another episode of The Second Look. You can catch this sermon and much more at our website, cometoconnect.com. Have a great week.